Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Eileen Hammer and I'm part of Decoding Dyslexia Washington. We welcome you today to our talk with Dr. Stephanie Stoller. We're letting folks in and we'll get started in just a moment. In the meantime, if you'd like to let us know in the chat who you are and where you're from and maybe what kind of work you do, what your connection is to education or the science of reading, we'd love to see that. Right. Good to know. They're starting to pop up. Great to know. Good to see you all here today. We know that we have a couple of hundred people who showed interest in today's talk and nearly 100 who registered. So be very excited to see who's here with us today. It's lunchtime here in Washington State, so many of us our educators are still working, so they'll be watching the recording, but it looks like many of you are joining us from Central and East Coast time, so glad that you could be with us live. Okay, Christine, shall I launch? Great. Well, I'd like to take a moment as we get started here and do a land acknowledgement as we do here in Washington State. We who are here locally stand on the lands of the Coast Salish people whose ancestors have resided here since time immemorial. To acknowledge this land is to recognize its longer history and our place in that history. We would like to express our respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors and extend this respect to their descendants and to all Indigenous people. Before we get started, we'd like to start with some meeting agreements that I think are probably fairly familiar, but we'd like just to remind folks to keep your sound on mute. We will be using the chat for comments or for questions, and we have several folks who will be monitoring that. We hope to have some time at the end to get to those questions, and Dr. Stoller is an adept presenter, and so I'm sure that if she sees something pop up that she's able to answer midstream, she will. Closed captioning is available and can be found on your toolbar, and our recording has started, and this will be posted and available for you after the event. So we welcome today Dr. Stephanie Stoller. She is the founder of Stephanie Stoller LLC and the Reading Sciences Academy. She is a part-time assistant professor at Mount St. Joseph's University and is also one of the founding members of the National Alliance for Supporting Higher Education. Stephanie is a school psychologist. She's worked as a consultant, has been the vice president of professional learning with Acadians Learning, and is just a wonderful presenter and extremely knowledgeable on this topic. So we are thrilled to have her here today. And Stephanie, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Eileen, and thanks to everyone behind the scenes who has made this presentation possible. And thanks for the work that you're doing on behalf of children and their families. I appreciate the opportunity to spend a little time talking with you about one of my favorite topics, progress monitoring. And I believe our hosts have a copy of my slide handout, and they'll be making that available to you in the chat. Please feel free to put questions for me in the chat. Our hosts are going to help me make sure that I pause and ask for those questions, and they're going to also be ready to interrupt if need be. So we are going to talk today about how progress monitoring can be helpful in our quest for better reading outcomes for our students. It is one of the essential assessment purposes within an MTSS model. And I'll give you some things to think about in terms of using progress monitoring data to make decisions across Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. So what do I mean when I say progress monitoring? I mean a picture like this. The idea here is that we are making decisions about students, lots of different kinds of decisions about students based on their performance over time rather than at a single point in time. You know, I used to work as a school psychologist, and one of my roles was to do evaluations of students, comprehensive evaluations, sometimes for determining eligibility for special education. And one of the challenges of that context was that I was external to their learning environment. I was not part of their classroom environment. I was often using tools that were disconnected from what was going on in the classroom and expected to make an inference based on those quote unquote specialized assessments back to what was happening in the classroom. And what I came to learn is that that didn't always serve students very well. It didn't always meet their needs. It didn't help the educators working with those students to meet their needs. And what I found to be much more valuable was to have a picture like this that showed some basic elements: performance on some important skill along the left-hand side, time along the bottom, representing where the student is starting at the point of initial concern, representing out in time where we want the student to be with some kind of a representation of a goal, connecting those dots, just like we would see on a GPS, a map on our phone or in our car, connecting the dots from where the student is now to where we want them to be in the future, and then identifying the student's progress over time. So we can see and compare if the student is progressing towards that goal that we've set. And then this piece, which may be newer to you in terms of a progress monitoring graph, identifying with a vertical line the point in time where instruction changed. We might call this a phase change line or an instructional change line. So we know when we're looking at this graph that to the left of that vertical line, instruction was in one way. It represented one set of instructional conditions, and to the right of that vertical line, instruction was different. So that point in time is when we made a change. Having this kind of information allows us to make decisions about the effectiveness of our instruction. And that's what progress monitoring is all about. Sometimes people get confused and think we're measuring the student's progress. What we're actually measuring is the effectiveness of our instruction as the adults in the environment. This kind of data gives us feedback about whether or not our instruction is working. Should we keep it the same? Should we make a change? Do we need to change? Not so much something about the student. So I want to put this entire conversation within the larger picture of the definition of the science of reading that comes from the Reading League. This is a piece of the defining guide. I encourage you to download this, make this your own definition, share it with people that you work with. And towards the bottom, you can see a couple of elements of the definition that I have highlighted here, that assessment is part of the science of reading. It is a critically important piece that allows us to get that match between the needs of the students and the instruction that we're providing. That definition of the science of reading helps us to know that there is a body of evidence that educators can rely on for helping to shortcut the work that we're doing with our students in a positive way. Help us to not have to reinvent the wheel, help us to have some good, solid information to stand on and be able to support our students with. One of those really critical findings is that prevention is much more cost effective, it is easier, and it is more effective than intervention. If students have a reading problem, it is much less likely that we're going to be able to easily turn that around. We don't have much evidence that it's easy to intervene once students have reading difficulties. It may take very intensive and individualized intervention to turn it around once it's a reading problem. But what we do know is that we have a lot of information that can help us prevent reading problems from happening in the first place. And that's where we should really be putting our attention. So any progress monitoring that we might do with students is going to be best maximized by focusing on prevention and early intervention to the extent possible. We also know a lot about the opportunity to teach in a way that puts the odds in the student's favor of reaching that destination of reading comprehension. All of our reading assessments, all of our reading instructional activities are geared towards the goal of reading comprehension. So this image that I'm showing on the slide is sort of a representation of what's in the simple view of reading, just calling out a couple of elements of language comprehension and word recognition that interact and come together to produce skilled reading comprehension. And if we think about the progression of skills from left to right through this sequence, we can see how it's possible to prevent reading difficulties for young children. And if we work the sequence backwards from right to left, we can identify where we might need to take instruction for students who are older and struggling. I use the three-tiered model, multi-tiered systems of support, as the way for implementing what's known in the reading research. You'll notice that MTSS is part of the definition of the science of reading. It's not something separate. It's not something extra. It is the framework that we use to implement what's known in the reading research. This is what keeps us from having a random collection of interventions and somehow calling that MTSS or the science of reading. This is what allows us to contextualize what's known in the reading research and really put it to work for our students. Helps us to know what our students need, what our local resources are, what the needs of our local community and students might be. And so MTSS for me really boils down to having knowledge of what students know and don't yet know, using that information to design the most effective first reading instruction that's possible in the regular classroom, that's tier 1, and then intensifying support as data on students suggest that they need more. So intensifying without having to wait to fail, intensifying possibly from day 1 of kindergarten, intensifying support without having to have labels or any of those barriers to accessing services for students. And I'm depicting this three-tiered model as a three-dimensional cone rather than a two-dimensional triangle, because there are systemic components to MTSS that are often overlooked or just not fully explored. And I'm going to be touching on a couple of these today. One being the collaborative problem-solving process, this data-based decision-making framework that progress monitoring sits within. So I'm going to show you those steps in just a second. I'm also going to be exploring the assessment component. So progress monitoring being one of 4 types of assessment that you need to implement an MTSS model. So let me show you first the steps of the problem-solving process, just setting the context for where progress monitoring fits. So problem solving is that decision-making model that allows us to use the assessment data that we have. It actually drives what assessment questions do we have and which assessment tools do we need to answer those questions. We're going to be using problem solving in MTSS if we're talking about individual students, but perhaps more importantly, when we're talking about the systems in which every individual child is learning to read. So that systems context. The first step is to define the problem in an observable and measurable way. So we really know specifically what are we targeting for change. Analyzing the problem by asking how and why the problem is happening, leading to additional assessments being collected, and ultimately resulting in a hypothesis about why the problem is happening. So we can design an action plan or an intervention, if we're talking about individual students, that is very likely to work because it's lined up to the hypothesized reason for the problem happening. So you can see how these things are linked together. And then evaluating the effectiveness of that action plan or intervention, and possibly going right back up to the beginning, possibly having to cycle through this more than once if we don't get it right the first time. There are purposes of assessment that function at each of these 4 steps. This is what fuels teaming at all levels of the system. We're asking these same 4 questions, working through the same 4 steps, whether we're talking about a district full of students, a whole school building full of students, or an individual student. It's the same thinking process. And it actually is the way that the community members and members of the school staff become more skilled at solving any problem that might come their way. It's a different way of thinking. So we're going to talk about 4 purposes of assessment, progress monitoring being one of them. Universal screening is most helpful for helping us to define the problem. Is this an issue for a single student or an issue for a whole grade level full of students? Diagnostic assessment data is helpful for problem analysis. And here's our progress monitoring. This is where we are evaluating the effectiveness of an intervention or instructional program that we've put in place for a student. So we need all 4 types of assessment in MTSS. A good school-wide assessment model will have a tool for each one of these purposes. And they are different purposes. They don't overlap necessarily, although there's one exception to that I'll clarify. So we need, first of all, universal screening tools that answer the question, which students and systems need support? This is what's going to help us to define the problem. Screening tools are typically brief indicators. They are predictive of future reading performance. They are designed to sample behavior that's important for students and give us information about not only student risk, but that system level risk. How effective is our first reading instruction in the regular classroom, for example? Because screening is brief, it doesn't tell the whole story. We're also going to need diagnostic assessment. These are typically not brief and not done with all students. And rather than just getting us in the ballpark of indicating a skill area that might need support for a student, this is the in-depth assessment where we're really fleshing out how and why something might be going wrong for a student and getting that fuller picture. So these are 2 different assessment purposes. Tools that work well for screening will not work well for diagnostic assessment, and vice versa. Diagnostic assessments make horrible screening tools, right? So these are mutually exclusive categories. They don't overlap. Progress monitoring assessments are formative tools that are designed to be used repeatedly over time to look at student growth and to reflect the effectiveness of our instruction. So the question that progress monitoring tools answer is my instruction working? Is it working in real time? You can think about this as a feedback loop to the instructor. And this is really important for that prevention and early intervention goal, because this allows us to make quick changes to instruction in real time on the fly. As we're teaching, we might be getting feedback that what we're teaching or how we're teaching it is not sufficient for the student, and we need to make a change. Not wait until the end of the semester, not wait until the end of the school year, make a change in real time. Some assessments that are designed for universal screening may also have the capability of being used for progress monitoring if they are designed for that purpose. And that would mean that they can capture small amounts of learning over time. So they are designed specifically to capture learning in small increments, for example, on a weekly basis. The 4th purpose of assessment is one that we're not going to spend any time on today. It's the one you're probably most familiar with. It's that summative assessment at the end of the year where we are asking, did it work? We're measuring our grade level standards or indicators, standards or objectives. Did our instruction achieve those for our students? We're looking back when we're giving outcome evaluation. So we are going to move through these next couple of slides quickly. I think I've said most of the things that are summarized here in terms of characteristics of the different purposes of assessment. So I'm not going to spend time on that, but this would be a good time if there are questions about clarifying the differences among these 4 purposes. I would be happy to address any questions that have come into the chat.
We just have one I can read off. For Eileen, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? I'll go. Yeah.
Sure. I was just asking, and you kind of touched on it, Stephanie, about the purposes, the larger computer-based assessments such as iReady and NWA and STAR often represent, it seems, as vendors that they can kind of be a one-stop shop, or that they can serve multiple purposes for districts. And it seems concerning that the districts aren't informed enough about the depth of what you're presenting to actually really discern the nuances of what those products can do and maybe what the limitations of them are. So I was just, through today's presentation, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I was going to go back a couple of slides to that image of the squares with the 4 purposes of assessment. It's really not possible from a psychometric perspective, from a test construction perspective, for one tool to be able to be used for all 4 of those purposes: screening, diagnostic assessment, progress monitoring, and outcome evaluation. So if a vendor tells you that their tool will serve all 4 of those purposes, you should be very skeptical. Those are different assessment questions. And so different tools would be used for answering those questions. The way that the assessment is constructed, it depends on the purpose of the test. So if you dust off your old measurement coursework or statistics coursework and think about test validity, is a test actually able to measure what it is intended to measure? It's not possible for a test to serve all of those purposes. So something that's used for screening, just from a practical perspective, would have to be brief, because you're testing all students 3 times a year. So brief meaning something like 10 minutes. There's decades of research about the effectiveness of very, very brief assessments for being able to do that universal screening function. Diagnostic assessment is much more in-depth. It's about identifying the very specific skills within a domain that a student knows and still needs to learn. So taking something like a skill inventory, a skill sequence, and dropping a pin to identify exactly where is the student on that learning continuum. Screening tools can't serve that purpose. So I would be very cautious about what salespeople tell you, about what test vendors tell you, and to be more informed yourself so that you can get the right tools in place that will serve your students well. I'm trying to think of some resources I can point people to. Susan Smart and Marty Haugen have a book that is really useful in pre-service teacher education. It has the word fundamentals in the title, and I'm going to botch the actual title. Fundamentals of early reading, instruction, and assessment, or something like that. Susan Smart and Marty Haugen. And they have a really nice foundational chapter in that book about assessment that lays out these 4 purposes. So that might be a resource for folks. I believe the Reading Rockets has a section of their website that goes through assessment purposes as well. And if folks want more information on this, I'm happy to share some of my resources on that topic. So let's focus in on progress monitoring. I'm gonna do what I tend to do, which is share information in response to questions that I often get and mistakes that I see people making or confusion that I hear. So that's just the approach that works for me. So hopefully this will connect with any confusion and questions that you might have. Progress monitoring, as I mentioned, is sort of like the GPS for educators. Just like a map that you would pull up on your phone, identifying where you are and where you want to get to, right? I want to go from Target to the Kroger grocery store in my neighborhood. It's going to chart a course for me to follow. And then it's going to track me relative to this pathway, right? And if I get off course, this little computer voice is going to say, recalculating, right? It's going to alert me to the fact that I'm not on track. And I might need to pull over. I might need to think about what I'm doing, where I'm going, right? Regroup a little bit. That's exactly what progress monitoring is designed to do when we are assessing individual students to see if our instruction is working or if we need to recalculate, if we need to make a change to the course that we're on. So you can see parallels between that graph that I showed you earlier and this image on a GPS. There are some misconceptions that are pretty common about progress monitoring. And I want to address one of them from the get-go here. And that is that the act of collecting progress monitoring data is somehow informative or instructive itself. And that is not the case. Progress monitoring is not what teaches children to read. It is simply like stepping on the scale when you're trying to lose weight. It's just the measurement, right? It's just the feedback about, are you eating too much? Are you exercising enough, right? It's just the measurement. So we have to be cautious about this when we're working in schools so that we are not making blanket mandates about progress monitoring that send teachers down the wrong path or get them working and spending a lot of time on things that are not actually going to be helpful for improving student reading outcomes. So here's the sequence that you want to keep in mind so progress monitoring stays in its proper perspective. And that would be that universal screening happens first. It's done with all students. That's where universal comes from. Then some decisions would be made with the universal screening data about the health and effectiveness of the classroom reading instruction. How effective is it to meet the needs of all students? Some changes to that classroom reading instruction might happen, some improvements to the curriculum, to the instruction, to the schedule, to the grouping practices. Some kind of instructional change would happen. And then we might think about monitoring progress for students. So this is the sequence: universal screening, then some kind of instructional change, and then progress monitoring. Unfortunately, what I see happening sometimes in schools is a mandate that skips over this important middle step that goes from universal screening to a mandate about progress monitoring. And the way that it sometimes happens is administrators will say, every student who scores below the expectation on the universal screening must have progress monitoring every other week or twice a month. That kind of a mandate is very, very common. And what that leaves out is that fact that the progress monitoring, that data collection itself, is not going to teach anyone to read. We have to keep in mind that the only reason to do progress monitoring is if you have changed the instruction. So that middle instructional piece has to be in place. And in some cases, we don't know enough from screening. We have to add diagnostic data to really inform what the instruction should be. And that might happen more than once as we're cycling through the problem-solving process. Let's talk about some of the other kinds of questions that come up when we talk about progress monitoring. These are practical considerations. For example, who should be collecting progress monitoring data? Now, let me say before I go any further that there are typically not standard answers to questions about progress monitoring. Progress monitoring is a very individualized endeavor, and it's really difficult to make blanket statements, to make broad generalizations about progress monitoring. So in general, the person who is delivering the instruction, the person who needs to know if their instruction is working, is the best person to do the progress monitoring. But this role can be shared, especially now with technology. It's possible for progress monitoring data to be entered into some kind of data system, and anyone who is supporting that student can see the data and can use it to inform their instruction. So anyone who's been trained to give the assessment can participate in progress monitoring. Shouldn't all fall on the classroom teacher. It shouldn't all fall on an interventionist or special educator. That role and responsibility can be shared among the people who are supporting any individual student. It's just typically not suggested that parent volunteers are in the role of collecting progress monitoring data. I want to go through some of the decisions that are often made with progress monitoring. You know, I gave you that one overarching question that we answer with progress monitoring: is my instruction working? But within an MTSS model, there are a variety, I've got 11 listed here, of decisions that progress monitoring data can help us to answer. So let's just talk about each one of these and see what questions you have. I've got a couple of images that I can show you that illustrate some of these things. These would be decisions that your building leadership team would make. These are things that get decided for the most part ahead of time so that you have consistency, hopefully within your school across grade levels, and even possibly across schools within a district. So first question that we can think about is, when would we move a student from receiving only tier 1 instruction to receiving tier 1 plus tier 2? Keep in mind that tier 2 supplemental instructional supports has the purpose of accelerating learning for students. It is designed to be that extra dose, that double dose of targeted instruction that students are receiving if they are at risk and if their core reading instruction in tier 1 has been proven to be generally effective. So in general, in MTSS, we would want to get those first reading instructional conditions right in tier 1, like you can see happened across this school year in the image that I'm showing, where the percentage of students who were on track increased across the school year from 51% to 67% to 90% by the end of the year. So really nice improvement over time. That's pretty good evidence that the tier 1 instruction that all students are receiving is effective within this system. If you don't have evidence like that, it's really hard to say that any individual student needs additional instructional support. So this is a real consideration in an MTSS model for using progress monitoring data along with the tier 2 or targeted intervention. A second decision to be made in an MTSS model is whose progress should be monitored. So I've already given you the clue to this, that we don't want to make those blanket statements like every student who scores below or well below benchmark should receive progress monitoring. Because if that was the case, in this example that I'm sharing from a first grade class, every single student would be receiving progress monitoring. And that's just not possible. That's not a good use of the teacher's time. I'm just using an example from Acadiance Reading. I am an Acadience mentor. I have access to sample reports. Your data system might give you a different type of report about who is at risk when you do universal screening. So that the data display might look different, but the concept is the same. Identifying from screening which students, based on how they scored today, are predicted to not be okay in the future. And those students need some change to their instruction. It might be that the entire class needs different instruction, or the whole grade level needs improved instruction. But we don't want to take time away from actually making those changes by asking teachers to monitor the progress of every single student who scores below or well below benchmark. It would be more effective in a context like this one to have this teacher or this grade level of teachers sit down and talk about how they can align their classroom reading instruction to the needs of the students that were just identified on this screening data. So for example, if at the beginning of first grade, the vast majority of your first graders can't yet segment phonemes and spoken words, well, rather than trying to provide intervention outside of the classroom by somebody other than the classroom teacher, rather than thinking about that as tier 2, it might be more effective and efficient to design instruction for tier 1 that includes teaching students how to segment phonemes, what the vast majority of students in that classroom need. So that's going to use your tier 1 instruction to the maximum benefit, which is to reduce risk. If we can provide effective instruction to all students, matched to what they need, we're going to minimize and shrink the number of students who need something additional, something more intensive, and also reduce the number who need progress monitoring. So this is a balancing act, right? This is one of those decisions that needs to be made based on the data in your school, but this will give you a way to think about that. Another question that's often asked that progress monitoring data can be very useful in answering is, how often should we monitor progress? Again, administrators, I know you like to have consistency within and across buildings in your district, but progress monitoring is probably not the place to look for that consistency. One of the ways that I see this happen often is administrators will say, every student who scores below the benchmark has to have progress monitoring twice a month, and every student who scores well below the benchmark expectation has to be progress monitored every week. And again, those kinds of mandates are missing that important middle step, which is actually intervening. And sometimes those mandates don't result in frequent enough monitoring to actually be able to make a decision. So let me give you an illustration of that. So this picture is showing progress monitoring for a student who's starting the year below expectation. Here's the goal later in the year. This is the path they need to follow in the orange dashed lines, and then the black X's are showing the student's actual progress over time. And to be able to visually look at a graph like this and answer the question, is it working? Is the student going to reach the goal in time? Takes about 5 to 7 data points to sort of visually be able to see a trend. So if we're only collecting data once a month, like you see in this example, it's going to be the middle of your benchmark time and beyond before we can make a decision about, do we need to change instruction? So monthly progress monitoring is usually not frequent enough. In this case, you can't make a decision until you're in April if you've started to collect data in September. Here's another illustration where we're collecting data twice a month or every other week. And you can see it's going to be January before you have that 5 to 7 data points on the graph to be able to visually tell if the student is tracking towards the goal or you need to make a change to your instruction. So in many cases, it's it's necessary to collect weekly progress monitoring. This is certainly the case when you are providing intensive instructional supports to students. If you are giving intensive support, if you are providing a lot of resource to a student, if a student is behind, if they are struggling, if they're working below grade level, they don't have a minute to waste with you trying out different things or figuring out what might work. You need to have very frequent feedback in that scenario so that you can make a quick decision. You can change your instruction if it's not working. The idea is not to document failure. The idea is to get the conditions right to enable the student to learn. Now, related to older students specifically who might be struggling, progress monitoring may not be done in grade level material. It's best when the progress monitoring materials are lined up to the point of instruction. So this might be grade level materials, but it might also be below grade level measures or materials that you're using for monitoring, or even above grade level if you're talking about students who need accelerated curriculum, for example. So thinking about the materials that are used is an important consideration. If you are monitoring students with materials and measures that are typically used for screening at that grade level, they're working towards grade level goals and expectations, using the grade level end of year goal is appropriate. But if students are working in below grade level material, you might need to think about accelerating their progress so that they are not just being accommodated, not just being met where their current skill is, but they're actually being accelerated and they're being caught up. One way to think about this is to set goals that cut the timeline in half. So instead of expecting them to get to that goal by the end of the year, you're setting a goal in the middle of the year and looking for much more accelerated progress, which may mean more intensive instructional support to make that happen. So a couple of scenarios for thinking about decisions around when to change instruction. Here are a couple of different images that represent those scenarios. So if the student has met the goal that you set for them for their progress monitoring, you can move on. And moving on might be going to the next higher level of material. It might be moving on in terms of setting a higher goal for the student. It might mean moving on in terms of fading the intensity of the intervention. Any of those would be appropriate when the student meets the progress monitoring goal that you've set for them. There's some confusion about meeting goals. Sometimes people think students have to have met the progress monitoring goal for 3 data points in a row. That's not the case. If the student is making somewhat steady progress, like you can see on the graph that I'm showing, there's a little bit of going up and going down, but generally the trend is upward. Once the student reaches the goal, good enough. Now we can move on to the next level, to the next skill, to the next higher goal, whatever the case may be. We don't need 3 consecutive data points in a row to confirm that. If the student looks like they're tracking towards the goal, they are on track as you are reviewing their progress monitoring graph, then we should keep the instruction the same. We should keep on keeping on. But if we see that the student's data and performance are not tracking towards the goal that we set, now it's time to make a teaching change. This is the part I find most people forget or don't have time to do because they're being asked to monitor too many students or just find to be too complicated. But this is in fact the most important part of progress monitoring. As I said earlier, collecting data with progress monitoring is not about documenting failure. This is not about showing how low the student is or showing everything that you've tried and nothing worked. Those are some common phrases, unfortunately, that I hear in schools. This is about showing you what it's going to take to enable learning. And if the student is not learning with the first way that you're teaching, then it's your responsibility and obligation to find a different way to teach until you find the way to teach that actually works for that individual student. So again, the vertical line on the progress monitoring graph is the most important part. It indicates that a change to teaching happened at that point in time, and you can continue to monitor the student's progress to see if your teaching change caused an increase in their skills. Now, sometimes we aren't sure what to think about changing when we don't see enough progress. So here are some things to think about. First of all, did you do what you said you would? Sometimes in education, we get derailed. We make really good plans, but they don't actually get implemented for a variety of legitimate reasons. But before we launch into an elaborate change to instruction, let's first just stop and ask, did we do the plan? Did we do the thing we said we would? What evidence do we have that that was implemented? Has the student actually received the instruction, or have they been out sick? Have there been interruptions like assemblies or author visits or things like that? Another important consideration if you're not seeing progress is, are you working on the correct skill? If you think back to that left to right progression that I showed at the beginning of the presentation, the sequence of skills that students have to acquire on their path to reading comprehension, maybe you're working at the wrong point or intervening on the wrong skill. Perhaps your intervention has been targeting reading comprehension, but the student actually is missing a foundational skill like decoding. So if you aren't seeing growth, it might be because you're targeting the wrong skill with your instruction. And in other cases, it might be that you need to adapt or intensify your instructional support. And I'm listing on this slide a couple of high value targets for intensification. Things like increasing the length of your small group intervention time, increasing the number of small group meetings across the week or within the day, reducing group size, which allows you to get more opportunities to respond. It allows you to get a more targeted instructional focus for the students. It allows you to have more practice opportunities to move students through the material and to automaticity more quickly. So those would be things to consider if you are not seeing the kind of progress that you hoped for. Now, one of the things that we don't think about frequently enough in schools is, when can we fade the instruction or the frequency of the progress monitoring? So in the scenario where your instruction has brought the student up to the goal, that's a good time to think about, is it possible that the student could maintain this high level of performance with less intensive support? And we can test that out. We can start to fade the support, but continue the progress monitoring and see if the student maintains that high level of performance. And if they don't, then that's really good evidence that we have to get back in there and step back in with that higher level of support. And then finally, considerations around very intensive resource allocation, such as when to increase the intensity of support and move students from tier 2 to tier 3, for example. One of the really nice ways to use progress monitoring data for this decision would be when you're monitoring a small group. I'm showing a graph that has 4 students who are all getting the same small group instruction, and monitoring them over time so that you can see in this example, 3 of the 4 students really were taking off. Their progress was accelerating. They were reaching the goals that were set for them, but 1 of the 4 students was not. This is a nice way of representing the fact that this small group instruction worked for 3 of the students. There's good evidence that that tier 2 instruction was effective. You need to have that. If nobody's learning from your small group instruction, it's really hard to say that any of those individuals needs more support. It's really about you changing the instruction. But that one student who's not learning in spite of this effective tier 1 and tier 2 instruction may need some more intensive support. So this would be the kind of image that would help you make that decision. And then finally, when to suspect a disability. Progress monitoring data is a very important component of this decision making. When to suspect a disability and initiate a multi-factored evaluation. And progress monitoring data can be very useful for making the determination of a disability. And once a student is perhaps identified as having a disability and an IEP is written, progress monitoring is baked into that special education service delivery. Progress monitoring is part of the IEP. So we don't stop monitoring if students end up on an IEP. It continues as part of that service delivery. So in summary, I like to think about the MTSS model as the framework for implementing what we know in the reading research, that vast body of scientifically based research that can inform and support the instruction that we're providing to students. Progress monitoring is only one of 4 purposes of assessment that are needed within an MTSS model. And progress monitoring is specifically for that feedback mechanism. It answers the question, is my instruction working in real time? It helps me know if I should keep my instruction the same or if I should make a change to get a different, better result for students. So collecting data over time helps us to make better informed decisions about students rather than having data that is collected at a single point in time. The goal is to improve reading outcomes. And if we are getting feedback about our instruction as we're teaching, we're much more likely to be able to improve outcomes for our students. Couple of resources that I would point people to: the definition within the defining guide, the definition of the science of reading, the IES practice guide that is about intensifying literacy instruction, the National Center on Intensive Intervention tools chart. They have a progress monitoring tools chart, sort of like a consumer reports rating on a variety of different assessments. The one that I mentioned that I'm most familiar with, Acadience Reading K6, is designed specifically for universal screening and progress monitoring, and they have a nice progress monitoring guidelines document on their website. I've done a couple of presentations that might be helpful to you. One at the Patent Literacy Symposium the last couple of years. I have some free science of reading resources on my readingscienceacademy.com website. And I have a course that I created for Ohio educators specifically about assessment and MTSS, but really it applies to anybody in any state. So check out those resources and stay connected to me. If I don't get to your question today, feel free to reach out. You can find me on social media. You can always contact me at stephaniestaller@gmail.com. And I have left some time for questions. So we can see if there are any in the chat. This will give you a few minutes to type your questions in the chat if you haven't already.
We do have a couple questions we
Great.
can get started with. The first one was, how does progress monitoring of all students dovetail with progress monitoring for those qualified for special education?
So the technology is the same. The measures can be the same. The goal is the same. The purpose is the same. So whether a student is on an IEP or not, it's the same assessment question. Is my instruction working? You know, unfortunately, in some cases, once a student is on an IEP, we think our assessment activities are over. Like we've done it and we're not doing any more assessment until we get to that 3-year reevaluation. Or we think, oh, I hate to say this, but it's true. that the quote unquote placement in special ed is the intervention, right? That's sort of general global statement that now they're on an IEP, that is the intervention. And all of our assessment activities, our changes to instruction stop at that point. That's actually not the case. Even more so, once a student is on an IEP, we have an obligation legally, if nothing else, to make sure that students are accessing the general education curriculum, that they are getting the resources and the supports that they need to do that. And we have to monitor if our instructional supports, our specialized instructional supports, our special education services are actually working. And it's more than just an annual review. It's more than just a reeval every 3 years. It should be this ongoing process of special educators collecting progress monitoring data to inform changes to their instruction, just like we're doing prior to a student being on an IEP, just like we're doing for students who are never going to be on an IEP. It really is the same technology and the same decision-making process. So I don't know if that responded to the person's question. You can have follow-up if it didn't.
Thank you. Thank you. Here's another one. Is there a source or reference regarding how many data points are needed to see change or to allow for decision-making?
About 5 to 7 data points are needed for visually seeing a trend on the graph. So that's where I was making the point that monthly data collection is not going to be sufficient if you actually intend to use the data, because it's going to be, this spring, March or April, if you started at the beginning of the year before you can see a trend in the data.
Thank you for that.
Stephanie, this is Eileen. Can I just clarify? I absolutely agree with you. And I think you articulated that really, it's just very reasonable and intuitive when you look at what you were just presenting. But I can imagine that if somebody goes back to their school team or their administrator and asserts that they may get pushback. How do you know that? What is that based on? That's kind of what, is it more of an experiential comment, or is there actual research behind that?
Oh gosh, there probably is. So where it's coming from would be the technical ways of drawing a trend line through graphed data would require you to have that as a minimum number of data points. So if you think about drawing a Tukey trend line, I'm going to get into some really geeky stuff, but if you draw a trend line through the data, you're going to need at least that minimum number. And so to me, it's just extrapolating, like you said, on a common sense basis. I'm not asking people to draw trend lines. I'm not asking people to do that in schools, but to have enough data points to see a stable trend over time. Is it going up? Is it going down? Something like 6 data points is really the minimum there. And 6 might not be enough. You might look at that and it's so variable that you can't eyeball it and say they're growing or they're not growing, or it's kind of flat. And so at the 6th data point, you might have to say, you know what, we've got to collect another data point to see if this is really stable enough to make a decision. Or if it's quite variable, there's other factors that are going into the decision making there.
Thank you.
I have one final question here for you. What would you suggest if a student has wildly different scores, both above and below the target line?
Yeah, well, that's a great follow-up, because if there is quite variable data, it can mean a couple of things. Gosh, many things are popping into my head. One thing that it can mean, in my experience, is that you are monitoring a material that's too difficult for the student. This is very, very common, that students are measured. Progress monitoring is done in grade level material only. Many people have not gotten the news that progress monitoring should match the point of instruction, which might be below grade level. So one of the reasons why you can see very variable progress monitoring data on a graph is because you are monitoring a material that's too hard. You're not lined up to the point of instruction. Another reason for variation in progress monitoring data can be things about the environment. So it could be something about the materials that you're using are not consistent. This is a real challenge, especially if you're measuring with something like oral reading fluency. If you don't know that those passages have been controlled to all be at the same level of difficulty, then you could get variation in progress monitoring over time simply because this story is easier than the previous one. So that's something to watch out for. And there are factors within the student that can cause variation in progress monitoring. That could be related to attention span and focus. It could be related to things that are happening in their life before they come to school or during the school day. It could be related to working memory, or it could be related to their disability, for example, that can cause that kind of variation. So those would be things to ask about if you're seeing variation, but a very high probability is that you're trying to measure a material that's too hard. That would be what I would encourage you to investigate first.
We have another question snuck in here. For middle school students with an IEP and special education services in a gen ed setting co-teaching platform, what sort of next steps should be taken if the students made no progress and are 2 or more grade levels behind? The students have educational diagnoses of ASD and ADHD. Should the students be further evaluated for SLDs?
So a middle school student who's on an IEP and not making progress, any additional assessment should have a very specific question tied to it. So what do you need to know? What do you think you don't yet know about that student that causes you to think that you need additional assessment? That the question that you have about the student that's not yet answered should drive any additional data collection. It's very, very possible that you have all the information about that student that you need, and you just need to change the instruction. If you're not seeing progress, I gave you kind of a short list. You really should focus on the instructional environment. What about the instructional environment needs to change? Are you not working on the right skill? Are you not providing instruction that's explicit and supportive enough? Are you not meeting with that student frequently enough or for long enough? Or are you not in the right group because you've got too much of a range of skills so that you can't focus in on what the student actually needs? Are you not providing enough practice opportunities for the student to really master and become fluent in the skills that you're teaching? Are you just moving on through the program and sort of leaving the student in the dust? All of those things are very likely reasons why a student isn't making progress. And those are things you can discern without probably having any additional assessment, or perhaps without a different diagnosis. So it's tough to answer those child-specific questions in general terms, but that's my best attempt at it. Let me say this, that when children aren't making progress, the very first place to look is in the mirror, is at ourselves as educators. That is the thing that we can control. It is the most likely reason, and it's where you're going to have the most impact. It is most likely something that you need to change in the instructional environment. And that's where I would encourage people to spend their time investigating.
So helpful. So helpful.
Just stop sharing here. I see names of friends who've joined us today. I just can't thank you all enough. Anyone who has given an hour of their time today to be here, to think about and talk about monitoring student progress, I have the greatest respect for you. And I just want to thank again the folks in Washington who have hosted this event today. Thank you for your work, not just your work coordinating this session, but the work that you do every day on behalf of students and families. I appreciate you.
Stephanie, thank you so much for being with us today. There's a link in the chat. Heather Schwint, who's with us on the call today, will be presenting on the same topic, but with a focus more towards families and caregivers. And that's on Wednesday evening this week at 7 o'clock. And the links for it, again, are in the chat or can be found on the Decoding Dyslexia Washington Facebook page or the Seattle Special Education PTSA page, along with our Washington Science of Reading page. So we encourage folks to join us there if you're able to. And again, that talk and all of the talks in this series will be posted and curated on the Seattle Special Education PTSA page. So we thank you all for joining us. Any other final thoughts from anyone? Okay, then I think we will sign off, and thank you again, Dr. Stoller, for joining us today. Everyone have a great afternoon or evening, depending on where you are.
Thanks. Bye-bye.